Good morning, everyone. I think it's time to start with our March coffee morning. Today, we'll explore how prescribed forest burning is used as a restoration tool in Fennoscandia, covering its history, current practices, and future directions. Our speaker today is Ellinor Ramberg, a newly appointed postdoc in our ecosystem management team and research fellow in conservation biology at the University of Tartu. Ellinor completed her PhD at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, where she studied the effectiveness of prescribed burning as a conservation tool. Besides fire, forest, and restoration ecology, Ellinor has also conducted research on aquatic terrestrial interfaces, particularly riparian zones. And her current postdoc position here at the University of Tartu integrates several of these areas with a focus on microbial communities as indicators in peatland restoration. Regarding today's coffee morning logistics, the presentation will last about 30 minutes, and after that, we will have time for the questions. And before the questions, I will also announce the topic and date for our next coffee morning. The presentation will be recorded and can be watched later on our YouTube channel, and the Q&A session will not be recorded. But that's all from me for now, and I wish everyone an engaging session. And Ellinor, we are ready for your presentation.
Thank you. Yes, welcome to my talk today. As mentioned, I am a postdoc currently at the University of Tartu, but I did my PhD on fire ecology, specifically prescribed burning, at the Swedish Agricultural University at Uppsala. And I think one of the interesting things with prescribed burning and restoration in general is that you don't only talk about or sort of touch on ecological processes when you talk about restoration, but you also sort of get interested in the history of these environments, and it's the same with peatlands, and also in methodology. How do we actually restore, and what's the baseline, and all these questions. And I think this is one of the really interesting things and the intersecting things between different restoration practices and environments, is that you have not only the ecology that happens on the site, what's happening to the species, etc., but you have the historical perspective to consider and methods and how do we do this, etc. And so that's basically what I'm going to go through today, because I think there's many interesting elements to something that is restored. So we'll start a little bit about wildfire, because this is, of course, the baseline. This is where we start when we talk about restoration and the historic elements of wildfire. So this is a natural disturbance in boreal and hemiboreal forests across the world, and also in Fennoscandia. And the lightning was the original ignition source. So nearly all wildfire is started by lightning. And there is studies to show that this is a midsummer peak. So these lightning storms sort of in early July, mid-July, are when most wildfires actually happened, because when the ground is also really dry. In extreme cases, you have stand replacing fires. So this basically means that everything is killed. So here you have a picture of a site in Sweden that was a stand replacing fire in 2014, where basically all trees died. And then you have a new successional cycle basically starting. So here you have, I think this is just a few years after the fire, where you have these basically only the mosses coming in and growing in the initial stages, and then you have vascular plants coming in, etc., and then new trees growing, mostly deciduous to start with. But this is quite rare actually in our region. Most cases are smaller and not as extreme, so you have more often surface fires, and this leads to more cohort dynamics. So you have stands with different characteristics, smaller on variation on a smaller scale, basically, and you would have this type of damage where you would have more deadwood created, burning of the ground layer, but a lot of trees survive, and that would, of course, mean that you have different characteristics over time. And then you would have pockets in the landscape where fire seldom actually reaches. So you would have really wet areas of mires that are really wet, etc., where fires seldom reaches, and these are refuges then for species that require these environments and longer term stability, basically, to survive. And so on a landscape scale, this means that if you have all of these different processes happening, you would have a really heterogeneous landscape and a lot of different habitats for species. And of course, this has led to a lot of adaptations to specific environments, but also to specific substrates that fire creates. So I'm going to go through some examples of these adaptations. You would have, for example, Daldenia loculata, which is a fungi that grows mainly on burnt birch trees and is tied to very many other species. So here you have an example, illustration by Martin Holmer with several different insects and beetles that actually feed and reproduce within this fungi. And so these are considered basically fire dependent. So they need this fungi and the fungi needs fire. So these are very specific. And that's quite rare today. And then you have fire scars, which is another very specific substrate or habitat that's created, where you have the heat of the fire creates a scar or an injury in the tree. And here they have the initial stages where you have this resin forming, the white on the tree. And it creates resin to sort of protect the damage and to try and stave off diseases, etc. And the actual injury zone in the initial stages where you have this resin flowing is a habitat for very specific beetles. You have also considered fire dependent, the Staphylococcus beetles, which reproduce in that initial scarring area. But then over time, this tree actually, because of this resin flow, is really resistant to rot. And so you form kela wood, which is this really resistant to sort of silver pines that you see in forests that can be standing as deadwood for several hundred years. And these are really important substrates for example, some rare lichen species. So this is also very specific and quite a long-term habitat in different stages of its development. And then you have the big one, which is tied to very many species, dead wood. We have about 60,000 estimated species that actually tied to dead wood in Fennoscandia. And of the red list, about 25% are dependent on dead wood in Sweden. So this is a really important substrate that is lacking today in many forest landscapes because of the managed forest that we have and the system that we have of clear cutting and planting forests. So this is also a very important substrate that fire creates, and these species have adapted to all these different things. Now, of course, humans have used and impacted wildfire regimes over a long time. And from about the 1600s onwards, we see quite a distinct human influence on fire regimes in Fennoscandia. Yeah, here you have an example from Norway, actually, Rolstad, where you have, and this is across Fennoscandia, where you have basically a system before 1600s where you have a few large burns, and then after, when you have the human sort of signal evident in the landscape where you have very many small burns. So the area of burning is actually not changing so much, but you have big fires and fewer early, and then you have this change to a lot more smaller fires. And this frequency is much higher, of course, than what lightning is basically possible to do to create this amount of fire over time. And also these fires would occur in different seasons. So they've actually dated the wood and seen that in early wood, so in the rings, you can actually see the signal of burning sort of in spring instead, which is very rare for lightning and wildfires. So you have very many different traces of this human influence on fire regimes, starting from about 1600s onwards. And the reasons for this were forest grazing. So you have cattle you burn to create grazing possibilities for your animals, slash and burn cultivation, which I know you also had in Estonia, and carelessness. When you have more people moving in the landscape, you also have a larger chance of wildfires being created basically from a fire used for cooking, etc., escaping. And this signal is actually also today evident, where you have, this is a study that I did a few years ago, where I mapped wildfires and also prescribed burns across Sweden during 5 years. And here you can see within the red circles, you have the larger cities, so Stockholm, Uppsala, Gothenburg in Sweden, and you have most of the wildfires in these areas. So this is where people move in the forest, they have barbecues, etc. And then you have an accident happening and fire spreading. But I should also say that the median size of all these fires, this is just the location of them, but the median size is also 1 hectare in general. So most of the fires are very, very small today. And this is the sort of the problem why we actually use prescribed burning, is because after around 1900s, we really started impacting the landscape in another way. We started suppressing fire, and quite efficiently across both Finland and Sweden and Norway. Since the forest had a more economical value, so we wanted to keep the forest intact and we didn't want to burn them. And so with this very efficient fire suppression, road network, etc., expanding, the wildfire and these wildfire regimes that even humans impacted reduced quite dramatically. And so this basically led to a lack of fire in the landscape, which has impacted a lot of species. And together with sort of the forest management system that we have today, with very little dead wood, we have a lot of species that are red listed and threatened because of the lack of fire and because of the system of forestry that we have. And that's why we use prescribed burning. But interestingly, prescribed burning to start with was actually a forest regeneration method. This is what was used initially from the 1920s in both Finland and Sweden. And basically they had, actually I'll go back on stage. Basically what we had was we started using the forest for economic reasons and cutting them down, but the regeneration was really poor, and this was a problem. And so they developed different ways before the larger sort of more mechanical ways that we have today. One of the methods to regenerate forest was to burn. So you would clear cut the forest or clear an area and then you would burn it, and that would basically the regeneration would be much better then because of the exposed mineral soil and the nutrients that were available compared to just leaving it without burning. And until very recently, actually, this was a very common reason for prescribed burning, both in Finland and Sweden. And in the study that I mentioned earlier that I did, between 2014 and 18, 65% of the burned area was actually prescribed burning. But of that, 58% was on clear cuts. So the largest portion of prescribed burning in Sweden during that time period was on clear cuts. And this is also seen in Finland. But the practice in general peaked between the 50s and the 60s, where you actually had really, really large hectares of forest being burnt, or clear cuts specifically being burnt for regeneration purposes. And here we have 2 historic pictures where you have a man using a sort of a birch bark torch to burn a clear cut. And then you have a regeneration of pine under a seed tree there. You have big pine, and then you have burnt the area around it, and then you have this regeneration of pine underneath it. But then you had more mechanical methods to sort of mix around the dirt after the 1960s. And so then the prescribed burning basically disappeared, or at least reduced drastically from this sort of really peak heyday in the 1950s. But I think this is probably one of the reasons this was a sort of a bridge between the more extensive wildfire that we had in the 1800s and earlier, and the more extensive and sort of managed prescribed burning specifically for restoration that we have today. So this was sort of the bridge which species basically could survive on between those 2 periods. And then prescribed burning started to be used, and we have in the 2000s we have 2 long-term Baki experiments in Finland specifically. There's also a few smaller ones in Sweden, but Finland has these 2 really good ones. We have the fire experiment, which is on pine forests, and then we have the Evo experiment, which is on spruce forest, which is also interesting because spruce is generally not considered to be fire adapted. Sorry. And both of them include different retention levels also, which is connected to this forest management, that they want to combine a fire with retention in different ways and see how that impacts species and the system. And here you have the fire experiment. There are different levels of burning and retention as an example. And these experiments were really good because you could trace the sort of or see the changes. You inventoried these forests beforehand, so living in dead trees, invertebrates, plants, mosses, lichens, polypores, forest pests, and many different other things that they looked at. So these were inventoried before the burning and the cutting, and then afterwards as well. And then you could see the changes. And now it's been quite a few years now, so we have these long-term changes also, which is really interesting. And from these experiments, which have been really important, you have a lot of good results coming out about what actually happens when you burn compared to not burning, etc. So we have a lot of answers from these experiments, which has been really useful for the actual practical use of prescribed burning within landscapes. And then we come to the sort of the core, which is what we use prescribed burning for today largely in Fennoscandia, restoration and conservation. And started in the early 1990s on quite a small scale. But then we've had a few really larger experiments or large projects. We have the EU project Life Taiga between 2015 to 2021, which burned quite a few hectares across Sweden. And this extended to include Finland, and now it's a large ongoing Life 2 Taiga project, which started to 2022 and is ongoing until 2028. And so that's both in Finland and Sweden, like I said, and it's 215 burns in total they plan and 3,400 hectares. So it's still not a massive amount of land, I know, compared to peatland restoration, for example, but it's still for fire. It's quite a lot of land being burnt, or forest specifically. And the aim of these restorations are to diversify forest stands. So you want more species coming in, deciduous tree types, and you also want more age categories. You want to create dead wood, so this is a very important substrate for many species. You want to benefit these fire-dependent species specifically, so creating fire scars, etc. And then you want to restart the successional cycle, so you want more natural systems, basically, or ecosystem processes in the forests. And how do we do this? Of course, this is a lot of planning behind this. You have when you actually start burning, you generally use a drop torch, which is used to ignite. Here you can see me burning some blueberry shrubs. So that's the commonly used tool, and you sort of just dip it down and it starts burning. And you can deploy it in points, which you can see here. I don't know if I can use the pointer maybe to show what I mean. You have these sort of points here where you have someone has gone around with a drip torch basically and started small fires, and then they burn together into a larger fire. And you start by burning against the wind, so you create a sort of a blackened buffer, which then you can release the fire against when you have a good safety zone basically. So you see here, you can see in the map they started in the corner over here. Created a buffer, and then they started releasing larger stretches and finished over here. And the timing of the fire is largely connected to the weather, relative humidity, etc. You want to burn when conditions are quite dry, but obviously not so dry that it gets dangerous. Safety is, of course, a very large aspect. Here you can see a couple of firefighters and people working at the prescribed burn I was at, and you have these pipes, or what's the word? Slung, yeah. Hose is probably the word that you use, with water surrounding the entire site, which you can see here on this map as well. So I was going to show you some crucial things. What you need is an escape plan that you have here. This is a sort of a collection point on the map. So there you would have the cars, etc., and you could leave. So this is a road, but you also have roads here, for example, here. So you would have several extra exit strategies from this site when you plan a burn. You need water sources. So you have basically hose surrounding the entire site, and then you would have stations where you have pumps constantly pumping water round and round and watering the site around the actual fire. Safety gear, of course, all personnel need safety gear of different size, usually quite strong colors. You monitor weather conditions, of course, quite closely, both before and during the fire. And that's especially the wind conditions that are important, because if the wind changes direction, for example, and you've created this safety zone that's blackened, and then suddenly the wind changes and fire just escapes, you have a problem. And then you create fire breaks. So here you have quite a good example where you have roads used as fire breaks, 2 roads there, and then you have a little stream here. I don't know if you can see it, but you can have a little stream there. That's the other fire break. But if you don't have natural or man-made road fire breaks, then you dig a ditch basically and you wet it a lot in the forest. And then you need to monitor the direction of smoke, and that's mostly for surrounding villages that you don't want to frighten them too much. So you need to make sure that they're aware. And then you have a lot of crew, of course, managing one of these types of sites. You would have people managing the fire line, people lighting inside the fire, and then you would have spotters around the fire site. Also, quite often, drones are used to monitor escaping fire, and you would nearly always have today a helicopter on site as well to extinguish any escaping fires. And then there's a thorough mop-up operation when the fire is actually done. And that requires basically you would wet down the entire site with these pipes that you've laid and monitor all embers. And that goes on for several days, night and day. So it's quite an extensive safety operation doing these burns. And here you have an example of a site that's just been burnt, basically. Well, are the goals of these restoration burns actually met? I did a study on this, my PhD basically focused on. So the live taiga burns between 2015 and 2021, I inventoried and studied. And these are some of the restoration goals, which I mentioned before. So creating dead wood, you want to diversify the forests, and this fire scar formation that you want to create. And there's also basically that overall, yes, there is restoration goals are being met, but there's a really large variability between sites. And here you have an example or several examples of how sites could look like. So you have some sites where you have a lot of dead trees, dead wood being created, so nearly a stand replacing fire. And then you have other sites where basically nothing is happening except you have the sooting of the ground and some regeneration of blueberry. And then you have other sites where you have a sort of a moderate fire, so you actually have deciduous trees regenerating, for example. And this, I mean, overall, it's quite a good result, but the variability is worrying because you want when you do these really expensive restoration practices, you want to know that you have getting the results that you actually want. But it's, I mean, a lot of things play in here. You have the methodology of burning, but then my study also showed that weather before and during the burn was really important for the results, and also stand characteristics. So what was actually being burnt, what types of forests were being burnt. Most of them are pine dominated, but you have different, for example, spruce elements in these forests, which impact how effective they are, basically. So what can we do to improve results to make them more effective, basically, these prescribed burns? One of the things which is quite a difficult one is the weather and the season. Obviously, we can't burn when it's most dangerous. That's quite obvious to everyone. I think you don't want to burn when a really windy, hot, dry day, because then you would have a wildfire instead of a prescribed burn. But when you look at this figure here, where you have the 2 different peaks in prescribed fires and wildfires in Sweden, you see that there's quite a big difference between when they're done. You have the wildfires done in sort of they burn basically in midsummer, whilst the prescribed burns are quite early in the season, so May, early June. And the problem there is that after snowmelt, the ground is really wet still. And so you have certain goals, for example, the deciduous tree regeneration is basically impossible to create at that time point, because you would need dry ground to burn away the humus layer and expose mineral soil, which is needed for regeneration. So this is problematic, and you sort of have to think if the goals you're setting are realistic, basically, and plan for that more specifically, and maybe perhaps burn later in the season, at least maybe not peak summer, but towards the autumn. Would be recommended. So basically there has to be a better syncing between the weather and the season and the burn goals for them to be a bit more effective. The landscape around also really important and should be considered. For example, here you have a figure with the landscape, and then you have the prescribed burn sites, and you can think, or we know that dispersal to the prescribed burn site is happening from the landscape around. I mean, you burn a site, basically everything dies or leaves the site during burning. And the dispersal source into the site again after the fire is from the landscape around. And so if you don't have the species that you want to sort of help in the landscape around, basically there's no point in burning. There has to be a thought about what's in the landscape around in relation to what goals you actually have for the species that you want to improve the habitat for. And I found, for example, that wood inhabiting beetles in these prescribed burn sites, the species richness was higher when there was a high proportion of protected forests in the surrounding areas. So basically, if you have protected forests, you have perhaps more dead wood and different types of dead wood, which these beetle species then live in, and then they can move into the prescribed burn sites afterwards. So basically, the landscape really matters, and this should be considered to a larger degree. And then another idea or another suggestion, I think, which is quite interesting, and I don't think many restoration practitioners consider this, but spruce forests, I think, should be considered to be burnt more often. Pine is generally the dominating type of forest to be burnt because they're more adapted to fire, and spruce generally dies from fire. But this creates these natural early successional forests, which are quite rare in the landscape. Most early successional landscapes or forests in Sweden and Finland today are after clear cutting, where basically all dead wood is gone. And so these types of environments that you can see here, this is from the Eva experiment, which was the spruce forest being burnt. You have quite interesting forests being created and habitats for species. So this is something that I think should be considered to a larger degree to restore and burn, creating these early successional environments. And I think that is basically the end. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellinor. You can already start thinking about the questions. You can use the chat or your microphone. But before that, I would like to quickly announce our next coffee morning. So our next coffee morning will take place on April 21st, and this time our speaker will be Kaarel Pent, who is one of our landowners and who will share his farm story towards more sustainable land use. And the coffee morning will next time be in Estonian as usual. So you can already mark that on your calendars.